It's not reasonable to think that we're going to get rid of these infections entirely. It's because people are like, oh yeah, we just have to get rid of them. No, it's about creating a new relationship with them, which is definitely a lot nicer because they're just trying to survive in this environment, which has become increasingly hostile because the immune system is going after a whole bunch of things. And so we just need to quiet everything down and recalibrate and reset this relationship that we have with these infections.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Dr. Evan Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch is a world-renowned energy expert and is the founder and CEO of the International Center for Fatigue. Through his best-selling book, podcasts, and international online programs that can be accessed from everywhere, he has helped thousands of people around the world optimize their energy and resolve their mystery symptoms naturally without medications. Dr. Hirsch is on a mission to help 1 million more. Fatigue affects millions of people, and most people don't realize resolution is possible. Conventional medicine does not have good tools to treat fatigue, and thus a functional and environmental medicine approach must be used. Welcome, Dr. Hirsch. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Dr. Ernst, thanks so much for having me on.
You are welcome. It'd be good, to just kind of get you started in what you specialize in. And, we kind of touch the surface when we talk about chronic fatigue or those kind of things, but there's a lot of depth to that. So maybe kind of just expand on that a little bit to get us started.
Absolutely. So I'm on a mission to help 1 million leaders, executives, and everyday people take their energy to the next level. I had fatigue for 5 years. My wife had fatigue for 3 years before I did. Just about destroyed our lives, our relationships, my relationship with my daughter at that time. I could barely get off the couch in order to play with her. I had all this overhead at work and I couldn't even do my job, and it was incredibly stressful, and I don't want anybody to have to deal with that. So that's the mission that I'm on, and I just really appreciate you having me on today so that I can help people. So it's, people come to see me when they've like changed their diet and they've taken some supplements and they still haven't resolved their exhaustion or their fatigue, and it's negatively affecting their life, and they can't have the kind of success that they want in every aspect of their life, personal and professional.
So what are, some of the pearls that you've found over your own personal journey and journey with people that you've worked with, and when we talk about, let's just start out some of the pearls you found with causes, and what's kind of been the unique findings that you've developed, because you can find a couple causes, but it sounds to me like you found, hey, there's a certain series of causes you really got to address.
Yeah. And so what I found is that there are 33 different causes of fatigue. We can put these into 10 different categories, but there's 33 different causes. And then everybody who has fatigue has 20 plus causes. Right. So it's not like you have one cause. It's not like, hey, I got adrenal fatigue, I fixed that and it's going to go away. Right. So it's like having 20 nails in the bottom of your foot and you have to remove all 20. Otherwise, if you leave one in there, it still hurts when you walk.
That's interesting. What are the general categories that those 33 fit into?
So the way that I like to divide them up is we're looking at deficiencies and toxicities. So deficiencies are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be, and toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there, right? So those are the two main categories. And then when we're looking at deficiencies, we're looking at deficiencies in hormones, like adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, mitochondrial function, right? The mitochondria produces 80 to 90% of the energy in our bodies. We've got deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, deficiencies in neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, GABA. We've got deficiencies in lifestyle habits. So not enough water, not enough good food, not enough sleep, not enough movement, not enough good use of the breath, right? And then with the toxicities, we're looking at things like heavy metals. 100,000 pounds of mercury are dumped into our oceans every year.
Right.
If you live by a coal plant, you're getting a lot of that runoff. Chemicals, 86,000 different chemicals we're exposed to on a regular basis, generally 500 before you even leave the house in the morning if you're commuting, right? Molds, about half of all buildings in first world countries have water damage, and most of those have mold. And it's so funny. Just happened to me the other day. I was on an airplane with somebody and we were having a conversation. He had like chronic sinus conditions. And I was like, well, hey, I'm not doing anything for the next 2 hours. You mind if I ask you some questions about that? But I asked the mold question and I said, hey, have you ever lived in a home that had a roof leak, a busted pipe, or a flood? And inevitably, everybody says no, or 99% of people say no. And then as you continue to have the conversation, like we would stop conversing or whatever and go and I read my book or whatever. And they'd be like, you know what? Actually, and then I had this exposure too. So it's kind of funny. So that's molds, which are just incredibly common. And if you live in a place like we do in the Pacific Northwest, where humidity gets above 55% on a regular basis, that's really the place in which mold will grow in your home and also in your body, which is why oftentimes people will feel better in some of the drier climates with less humidity. But people will also say, hey, I want to live in the Southwest because I've got mold issues. And the joke is, are you going to have indoor plumbing? Because you're going to live in a house because
Yeah.
there's just so many risks to living in a house. But anyway, I digress. So we said heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and then there's the infections. So we've got Lyme type infections like Bartonella and Babesia and Borrelia and Anaplasma. And then we've got the viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, the new pandemic virus. We've got HHV6. We've got cytomegalovirus. There's parasites. There's yeast. There's bacteria. Some of these are in the gut. Some of these are in different parts of the body. So that's infections. And then negative emotional patterns.
Right.
So anything that has occurred in your life that was stressful for you that you carry around with you will cause stress on the body and will need some reprogramming in the brain. There's something called neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain can be reshaped based on our thoughts and our beliefs. And so we actually have a nervous system, limbic system retraining coach on staff. We do a lot of mindset work, so everybody gets this stuff going through our programs. And then the last thing is electromagnetic fields. So, anything that has a battery in it, will produce, or plugged into the wall, will produce wavelength. There's also dirty electricity that comes from the poles that aren't really doing a good job carrying all this new technology the last 30 years. And so those things we can be exposed to that will damage DNA, that will increase inflammation in the body. And it's really a combination of all of these toxicities that ends up being the problem. And oftentimes people will say, well, it's that one thing that I think is the cause. And that's usually the thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there was all these other things that were already at play in the body that didn't allow your body to get rid of that latest thing that ends up causing all of the issues.
Yeah, that's so good. I know in my office sometimes, I'll ask that same question about historical trauma or anything like that, and then there'll be the no answer. And then later in the conversation, oh yeah, I remember now. Just like you were on the plane getting that. No, I've never had a water damage. And the good point there is that in the Pacific Northwest, in some areas, mold will start growing even if you haven't had a water leak in some of those homes.
Oh, yeah.
In your garage or wherever that may be. Do you find when it comes to some of these exposures, like the environmental exposures, that has been a big key in some of the infectious, not only contagion itself, but also in how it can be more of a chronic contributor to the infection? I guess what I'm trying to say is the environmental exposures really kind of perpetuating the viral exposure.
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. You are a smart man. You understand what's going on. Because if you've got heavy metals, chemicals, molds, your immune system is hijacked off into left field, and then the infections become opportunistic. I was actually just having a conversation about this with my good friend, Dr. Tom Moorcroft, who's a Lyme expert, yesterday. Okay. And we were talking about this where, I believe that a lot of these infections we have in our bodies from a very early age. Sometimes we get it vertically, transmission from mom through the placenta. Sometimes we're getting it from ticks. Sometimes we're getting it from anything else that takes a blood meal or a blood transfusion, or maybe there's some intimacy, some sex or kissing or something like that can transmit it. But inevitably, most of us have these bugs. We've got, we're 90% bug cells, 10% human cells, essentially in this frame, which always, just blows my mind to think about.
Yes.
But it's really that if the immune system is functional, then it can keep these bugs in check. And it's just when it becomes dysfunctional with stress and the toxins and whatever else that's there to manage the immune system, that all of a sudden then the bugs become opportunistic. And that's why it's really to go directly at the bug. And this is why oftentimes Lyme doctors have challenges, is because if they're not focusing also on mold, heavy metals, and chemicals, as well as the negative emotional patterns, the nervous system retraining that has to happen, you go directly at the infection. You can hit it with the biggest hammer you possibly can, and guess what? Until you get the immune system back on board and you reprogram a bunch of this stuff, you're not going to have success.
Yes. Yes. I imagine you spend a great deal of time talking with patients. This is one of the hardest things I, have to do in my office, and trying to help them understand. And, if we consider the current situation, the pandemic and all that, some of the interventions that come into play, they're, these dormant viruses. If you put something in your body that activates that dormant virus, and you can get something that you say, oh, I got that and it didn't bother me at all. And I hate that kind of mindset, that it's like, I got some type of an intervention from the medical, approach, and I was totally fine. And it's like, well, you might have been fine for 10 minutes, 2 weeks, 2 years, but we don't know the complexity of it. And that's something I would like to just have you kind of touch on a little bit. I'm sure that that's part of what you're sharing here, is that we can do things thinking that we've done something that's good for us or been told it was good for us, but yet it may start a negative chronic fatigue, thread, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. The absence of symptoms is not the absence of disease, unfortunately. There was a recent study that was done for people who had the pandemic virus, and then it resolved. And 4 months later, a study was done and they did intestinal biopsies, and half of those people, and they had no symptoms at this point, half of those people still had live active virus in the intestines. And this is what we're seeing with people who have long haulers, is that the virus is persisting. And to speak to your point, which was a very eloquent one around reactivation, we're also seeing that there was one study that showed that 73% of people who had long haulers also had reactivated Epstein-Barr virus. So the question is, did it reactivate the Epstein-Barr virus? Or was the Epstein-Barr virus present, and consequently long haulers and those symptoms then of the virus persisted because the immune system was not able to just focus on this one virus and get rid of it? And what we're seeing with long haulers is it's the same picture that we see with chronic fatigue. It's just a different infection. Most of the time with chronic fatigue, mold plus an infection are, I would say, 80% of the time. It's this combination and it's usually multiple infections as well, right? So once again, the immune system is not functioning correctly, and consequently, then people are getting these persistent symptoms. And the immune system is, it's inflammation. If we work backwards, so symptoms are essentially pain and dysfunction, and they come from inflammation, which is the immune system reacting to something. And that something is a heavy metal, a chemical, a mold, an infection, an allergy, those sorts of things. And so we just have to remember that, yes, there are these things that are persisting in our bodies. And just because we take a steroid, which suppresses the immune system, which essentially suppresses the symptoms, doesn't mean that you fix the problem, which is that virus or whatever it is that just decides now to kind of go underground and hide. We're seeing 200 plus different symptoms of long haulers right now, and it's because of the virus's ability to get in different parts of the body. It travels in the blood and can be found in pretty much every compartment in the body. And wherever the virus is, the immune system is going to try to get rid of it. You're going to get inflammation, you get pain and dysfunction and symptoms.
Yeah, and in my office, I typically don't see people coming in post some type of pharmaceutical involvement having problems, and that's happening now. These interventions that have been going on the last couple of years, and it's kind of hard because I don't know where you're at on the learning curve, but we're all on this learning curve of here's this new intervention, and it's different, and it was only supposed to stay in one part of the body. It's spreading out through the whole body. It's hitting the organs. It's going everywhere. and people are coming in with neurological issues, some physiological issues, things of that nature. Are you seeing a bit more of that just because of the last couple of years?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there was one study that looked at, it was a retrospective study. So they looked at the um, electronic medical records of a certain company, and 265,000 people who got the pandemic virus. Within 6 months, 30% of those people had a new diagnosis of a mood disorder, of a mental health disorder. So we're talking about anxiety, depression, panic, suicidal thoughts. And what we're seeing is that, yes, sometimes it's from that virus, but sometimes it's from the virus's reactivation of some of these other infections, or how it's upsetting or disrupting the biofilm, the hiding place of a number of these infections. So oftentimes, if somebody has babesia, they're going to have like spontaneous sweating, they're going to have shortness of breath, they're going to have an awful time sleeping, they may have anxiety to the point of panic, and depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. And that can be reactivated by the virus. So sometimes it is from the virus, and sometimes it's reactivating some of these other infections.
Gotcha. So just would love to kind of get into a little bit of the stats of chronic fatigue. But before I do that, what are some of the primary issues that you're dealing with outside of virus that contribute to, some of these, and maybe hitting specifically on the emotional part of that? How are you looking at it from the emotional perspective?
So it's such a big part of this, and no matter who you are, whether you have chronic fatigue or not, I believe that our mission in life is to grow. I mean, that's a core value for me, and to evolve. And a lot of that has to do with our mental and emotional growth. And so, there's mindset work that I do every day that I recommend to my clients. I take them through a 4-step process that I call the daily mindset practice, where we're looking at gratitudes, just 3 gratitudes a day, and they can be the same gratitudes every single day, can make a world of difference in how you look at the world, significantly decreasing anxiety and stress in numerous studies. Then we look at, envisioning your ideal day and kind of walking through, what does your ideal day look like, whether it's a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. What does that look like? And part of that has to do with the fact that the brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. And so there's been some studies looking at people playing basketball, or people, and I think that was actually the East German government did some of those studies. But then there was also a study that was done at a Harvard on pianists, some piano players, where basically, if you thought about it, and this reminds me of the Music Man, like the think system that he talks about, where if you're practicing in your mind, it's almost just as good as practicing actually at that thing, as long as you're really detail oriented. The only thing you don't have is the muscle memory, and that's been proven numerous times. And so envisioning what you want your life to look like can be really incredible for eventually creating that. And then we look at what limiting beliefs people have, and we flip them on their heads into empowering beliefs. So for me, I grew up with scarcity, and so one of the things that's really helpful for me is every single day to remember that life is always working out for me. I can live in abundance, life is safe for me, that sort of thing. And then the last one is to look at any sort of disempowering questions that we're asking ourselves. Oftentimes people are saying, why is this happening to me? Right? And we want to flip it on its head into something that's more empowering, like, what can I do today to love myself even more? Or what can I do today to move my health forward even more? Right? To increase my energy even more. So mindset is a huge part of this, because like we talked about with some of the stressors that people might have had earlier in life, those are called ACEs, oftentimes adverse childhood events, or I call them ALS, adverse life events. I mean, I haven't coined any sort of phrase or anything, but it can happen any point in your life. You don't have to just be a child,
Right.
And it can be really severe, like a severe abuse, or it can be something that's considered to be less mild, like rejection of a peer group that I had several times during my life that, really stressed me out and was very challenging and made the world appear not to be safe for me. So I have to recalibrate that and remember that the world is a safe place, and that I am healthy, I'm strong, all that sort of stuff. So That's mindset. And then the negative emotional pattern stuff, we also have, like I said, a nervous system retraining coach, a limbic system retraining coach
Right.
on staff who coaches people one-on-ones as well as in groups. And we're actually going to be hiring a mindset coach to do the same. Then we also have a nutrition coach who's also a mold remediation coach. And then people get one-on-ones with her as well as groups, and then one-on-ones with me as well as groups. So we're trying to address every single cause, because I knew when I had fatigue, that was like my mission. I know if I can find every single cause and I can reverse it, that I'm going to be successful. Just like as a functional medicine tenant, it's these root causes. What is the root of the root of the root, right? And then looking at this whole combination. And so that's how we approach it, is that we're looking at all of these different causes, and we want to plug all of those holes that are causing the proverbial boat to be leaking.
Right. Very leaky. I appreciate that. I'm familiar with a few of those studies and how amazing the mind is and what they're finding. If you do just concentrate on something, it really does change that neuroplasticity. And it's really positive. And it can be very negative too. And, the different things, emotional trauma, things of that nature, fear, a lot of fear the last couple of years, get you going down the wrong road. I can't remember. It was a study several years ago, but the average human has somewhere around 600 or 60,000 to 100,000 thoughts a day. How can you manage those in a better way, and trying to change that up is hard, because it's really hard to get people to recognize, including myself, a lot of times, how many thoughts I'm spending on the wrong, way, so that's really such a huge part. So what are some of the, some people are out there and they don't realize they have chronic fatigue. What are the things that people should look for to kind of find out if they're even in the category? I would argue that there's a certain amount of what we're talking about here is applicable to everybody on the planet. Again, regardless of what their symptom pattern, what they think of their perceived energy level or anything like that. But what are some of the things that people could say, I didn't realize that was a component of chronic fatigue?
Yeah, and that's why I talk about fatigue, and more than I talk about chronic fatigue or chronic fatigue syndrome, is that it is this spectrum, and the only difference is the number of causes that you have and the severity of causes, right? But essentially, it's tiredness not relieved by rest. If you're tired every day and you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, or you're not getting to 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night because you've got a sleep issue and consequently you're tired, or you're surviving on caffeine every day, or you're taking naps every day, or you don't have the energy that you want to, like, there's a problem. If you're not able to do the things you want to do because of a lack of energy, that's your body telling you that there's a problem. Now, you deal with it now or you deal with it later, because all of these causes that we're talking about today are also the causes of heart attack, heart disease, Alzheimer's, strokes, cancer, autoimmunity, right? So those are the most common causes of death that I've just listed off, right? And so those just kind of build up in the body over time, and eventually they overtake you. So like I said, you deal with it now or you deal with it later, but you have to listen to your body and do something about it. Otherwise, there's going to be consequences, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's huge. What are some of the testing that you do to try to determine, what is happening? We've talked a little bit about some of the emotional kind of, inquiry, but just other testing that you do.
Yeah. So in terms of the emotional stuff, I should say, everybody needs the emotional work and everybody needs the mindset work. Like you mentioned, we've got all those thoughts, and 80% of our thoughts are negative, right? Yeah. So there's a whole, like, avoid negative news, avoid comparison on Facebook, avoid looking at your email where people are asking you to do something, all those things, at least first thing in the morning, in addition to doing like the mindset practice. Right. But in terms of the laboratory testing, one thing that gets me really excited is that 75% of these 33 causes, so 27 of these causes, can be determined by symptoms alone.
Okay.
So when people join our program and they go through step 1, and we've got this checklist, within an hour of joining the program, they can know 75% of their causes of fatigue. And we talked about how, there's like 20 plus causes that people have. I had 30 out of the 33 when I had fatigue, right? So it's really great to know as many causes, because then you actually have a map. This is like the Google Maps of like energy management here. Sure. Is because, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't have a map, then you're just shotgunning different supplements. Sally Sue over here may have a B12 deficiency and consequently B12 may help her. But Joe Schmo over here, if he doesn't have a B12 deficiency, guess what? He can take B12 till the cows come home. It's not going to help him.
Right.
Right. So I haven't gotten to your question yet, but I will in a second. So that's 75% can be symptoms alone. And then the 25% that we really recommend that people get labs on are for things like heavy metals, chemicals, molds, stool for infections. And then there's some blood tests that we recommend, but all the rest of those are urine tests.
Okay.
Which is really great because people can do it from home. And then the blood tests that we're looking at are going to be B12, vitamin D, iron. The rest of them we can really do based off of symptoms. And it comes back to this idea that labs are all imperfect. Even when I was in conventional medical school, they would say, 90% of diagnosis is your history and your the person's history and their symptoms, and that 10% is physical exam and labs, right? But we forget that, unfortunately, in medicine. And when I lecture to physicians, I say, hey, if you lean on your labs too much, you're going to fall over because essentially they're all imperfect, and you have to take all of the data that we have and incorporate it, and so that we can make the best decision to know what to go after.
Absolutely, that's good. So you go through the testing protocol, you find out what somebody's dealing with, and I wanted to kind of jump in just a little bit of your process. You've got a 4-step process, and so if you could kind of develop that a little bit further. I know parts of it you've already kind of spoke to, but the 4-step in its entirety would be good.
Just remembering that we're looking at deficiencies and toxicities as these causes, okay, and that this process is actually all about the toxicities. Like, the toxicities are absolutely by and far the most important thing that we need to deal with. However, we have to deal with it last, and I'll tell you why. So I'll get to that in a second. So in step 1 is to assess the causes. So people go through step 1, they go through the checklist, they know 75% of their causes, and then they can go into step 2 and start taking the supplements to replace the deficiencies. And they can get the labs along the way, but it's not uber necessary to be right at the first thing, which is nice. And when you're replacing the deficiencies, the first thing that we replace is what I call the big 3. So this is adrenals, mitochondria, and thyroid. So this makes a huge difference for people, because most of the time, what I found is that all of the people who go through our program have adrenal gland dysfunction and have mitochondrial dysfunction. So they need replacement for that. And essentially, I believe that everybody who lives in society, who has a job, who has kids, like these natural stressors, and who lives in an environment where we're constantly being exposed to all these toxins, like, you have to be supporting the stress mechanisms in the body so that you don't get overwhelmed, and so the body can maintain its nice circadian rhythms and whatnot. So adrenals and mitochondria, and those will actually make the thyroid work much better. So after we do those in order, then we go into thyroid, and we do a thyroid ramp up, which is subjective. So we increase by, if somebody has thyroid symptoms, low thyroid symptoms, we increase by a little bit of thyroid every 2 weeks until we get a little bit too much, then we back off. And that's kind of we're always talking about the Goldilocks dose in our program. What is the specific dose for this individual? But that makes a huge difference, and everything works better. We know that adrenals and cortisol manages the immune system. We know that mitochondria affects the immune system. We know that thyroid affects the immune system and inflammation. And thyroid is an amazing anti-inflammatory. It's amazing for lowering blood pressure. It is the best thing for lowering cholesterol besides diet. So, like, all those things make everything work better. Okay. And then the other things with step 2, we're looking at replacing vitamin deficiencies like vitamin D, vitamin B12 if it's present, iron if it's present, though we do have to be careful if there are infections that will feed on iron. So we sometimes have to watch that. Any sort of neurotransmitters that are deficient, and then focusing on the lifestyle habits, not enough good food, not enough water, not enough movement, not enough sleep. Now, you notice that at the end of step 2 of replacing the deficiencies is when I talked about lifestyle habits, because a lot of people come to see us are like, I can't even think about modifying my lifestyle habits because my energy is so low. But when we do the big 3, and their energy goes from a 3 or a 4 or 5 out of 10, where 10 is ideal energy, up to a 5, 6, 7, then all of a sudden it's just a lot easier to make some of these changes.
Lifestyle.
And yeah, lifestyle habits and whatnot. And so, plus also a lot of people who come to us have already seen naturopaths, functional medicine docs, integrative docs, several of them usually, and they've spent a lot of time in step 2, where they're like, yeah, I've taken lots of different vitamins and minerals to replace these things. I've modified my lifestyle habits, all this sort of stuff, and I haven't had the success that I want, right? And so that's kind of like why we put that there. But we do step 2, and you have to do step 2 to be strong enough to deal with step 3 and step 4, because it is stressful at removing these toxins out of the body. So you have to make sure that you can tolerate that. Otherwise, you start to pull out heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections. And guess what? The first thing that happens is that if you're killing off this infection, you can get die-off, which can damage your mitochondria and can stress out the body and decrease your adrenals. And then guess what? You're feeling worse, and you're a couple of months behind the 8 ball now. Right. So replacing those things in step 2 is imperative. And it's also nice to get some quick wins. It's nice to feel better, right? It's nice to get a boost in your energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then step 3 is in preparation for step 4. It's to open up these detoxification pathways. So when you have these toxins, like everybody who has fatigue does, it is going to clog your detoxification pathways. And detox is kind of like a buzzword, but there are actual, if you look in a medical journal, there are detoxification pathways, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 sort of thing. And you do want to make sure that those are open. Now, I'm a health coach in the online space, even though I am an MD. So everything that we use is completely natural. So we're using herbs, we're using lifestyle habits, we'll use, coffee enemas, and we'll use castor oil packs, but mainly the herbs and the tinctures, because that's kind of the easiest thing when you're a busy leader, executive, entrepreneur, busy person in general, right? Where you're on the go. Right. You'd much rather take a tincture or a pill than, do a coffee enema in between meetings. That can be challenging, even though they can be really helpful. Absolutely. So we're opening up the intestines, we're opening up the kidney, the liver, the lymph, which is the garbage system of the body, and the neural lymph, which is basically the garbage system in the brain. And so that's step 3. Did you have a question somewhere in there?
I'm gonna come back to one because you might cover it in step 4. So okay. I'll wait. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's step 3, and basically what happens is if you're grabbing a toxin out of step 4 and you're pulling it into one of those detoxification pathways and they're clogged, that toxin is just gonna go right back into that compartment or into a different compartment, right? So you got to make sure that step 3 is done. And this is one of those places where I don't think enough time is spent. And oftentimes when people are having challenges with step 4, we have to pivot and come back to step 3 and be like, okay, now we have to open up the pathways a little bit bigger. I like to think of step 3 as like this funnel, where the bottom of the funnel is really tight when you're really congested. And then you can open it up with the step 3 supplements, and then you can dump the toxins in and you can actually have a path for them to flow out.
Go out.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So then step 4 is removing the toxins, and heavy metals. And there's some of these things that we already start in step 3, but we like to do it in this order: heavy metals, chemicals, molds, because oftentimes those things are going to take 6 to 12, sometimes longer months in order to make sure that the body likes small changes in order to make sure we're pulling out things a little bit at a time. But we talked about how the immune system has to be more functional, right? So we want to make sure we're pulling the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds out, and then dealing with the infections. And the entire time that we're going through this process, we're dealing with the negative emotions from day one. We'll get to the electromagnetic fields. Oftentimes, if people are reacting to those, it's usually from a total body burden. So when we get rid of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections, usually a sensitivity to electromagnetic fields goes away, But there's also some things that you can do to your home. You can check for dirty electricity, and you can put in some filters for that, and you can decrease your overall body burden. But that's usually the process that we go through. And the infections, or when we get into step 4, besides those first couple that need to come first, we're always looking for what is causing the worst, most uncomfortable symptoms that you have, the symptoms that are front and center. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody has Bartonella, they got pain on the bottom of the feet, they got muscle cramps, usually in the calves, worse at night, they got sleep problems. Sometimes they've got what looks like stretch marks, or what looks like a cat scratch on the body. Oftentimes they've got low thyroid. They can have some mild anxiety and depression, So if they have those symptoms, that's where we're going to go next. But we do have to be aware of what I call the whack-a-mole effect, where when you start going after one particular bug, then the other bugs jump out. So if somebody all of a sudden starts talking about, we just started going after Bartonella and now I'm sweating like crazy. Well, that's the Babesia, right? Or now I have joint pain that moves around the body. Well, that's the Borrelia or the Lyme, right? So we have to pay attention to those things. And, once again, we're plugging those holes as they pop out, because, it's really rare when there's ever just one infection. There's always multiple infections, and there's something that I call Bortezomia that can occur, which is basically this development of superbugs in the biofilm where the bugs are swapping their DNA, and you've got Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia all together in one bug. And so you start pulling off the Bartonella end, and then that releases some of these other bugs as well. So I just said a whole mouthful. I'm open to your questions.
Yeah. So coming back to step 2, when we're talking about trying to kind of build the body up a little bit, like you said, get a couple of wins, help the body feel a little bit better. Do you work on trying to get the gut health, like with probiotics or anything like that? Is that something that you utilize as far as being able to maximize the potential of efficiency of the other nutritional support you're trying to get to the body, so for better assimilation?
That is a great question. And the answer is sometimes.
Okay.
One of my most controversial videos or statements is about the gut. And, I see so many people who've spent so much time trying to heal the gut, and they're still not better. And oftentimes it's because they have these toxicities in step 4 that haven't been addressed. And I don't want to bash any physicians, any providers. Like, they all mean well, and they're all really good at, whatever knowledge that they have. Right. Yeah. But it's just the knowledge that they don't have. Right. And so if you're trying to heal SIBO for years and you're not having success, or you're trying to heal some issues that you have with your gut and you still have these issues, diarrhea, bloating, whatever, and you're not having success, it's because you have something that is hijacking the immune system and the nervous system, right? 80% of the immune system is in the gut. And we just said that if you have heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections, that your gut isn't functioning, and it's off in left field, right? So this is a major reason why people aren't successful. So we're always trying to give people the biggest bang for the buck. I do think that everybody needs a probiotic, but in terms of, how far we go down that gut pathway, I kind of save that usually for later, because, like I said, most of the people that I'm seeing, they've already done a lot of that. Oh no, not another gut protocol, like it didn't work the other 10 times. Well, it's like, yeah, we're not going to do that right now. We're going to come back to it.
So if I'm inferring a little bit here correctly, it may be better to utilize that after step 4. Right. Depending on the person, everything is unique to the person, of course. But and then, you kind of touched on a little bit on step 4. It could be a 6-12 month step. Mm-hmm. What about step 2 and step 3? What's kind of your time frame for those steps?
Yeah, they're generally done in a couple of months. Okay. So it's like, step 2 is, usually maximum of a month. What we do is that we're introducing a new supplement every 4 to 7 days, depending on how sensitive somebody is. So it's every 4 days. If you're not sensitive, it's every 7 days if you are. And sometimes you need to ramp up a little bit more slowly, and then it's going to take more time. But generally, that's kind of the goal, is to do every single one of these steps in, I shouldn't say at most, at least a month, or somewhere around a month. That's what we see, or at least the step 2 and then step 3. And then step 4 is where you're going to be spending most of your time.
And so, you talked a little bit about trying to get the body ready in step 3 for kind of opening up the pathway for the elimination of your toxins.
Mhm.
And in that, you were talking about herbs, tinctures, homeopathic kind of remedies, it sounds like, in a general sense, coffee enemas. And then in step 4, when you're actually really kind of getting into more of the elimination process, again, if I'm inferring correctly, what does that incorporate as far as, modalities and or supplements or interventions of whatever type, that step 4 process?
Yeah, it's 90% supplements. And
Okay.
so we're using binders,
Okay.
we're using glutathione or N-acetylcysteine or to help to get a number of these things out. And we're using binders that are, more specific for some of these different things, or we're using tinctures that are going to get at chemicals, the plastics and the number of these things that we can find in the body. It's really amazing. Once you start doing these laboratory tests, where you're like, where did I get all these gasoline additives? It's like, if you're not anytime you're driving around, if you don't have that recycle button pushed in, then you are just sucking on people's tailpipes, right? And there are so many different things, different components of gasoline and these gasoline additives. We're like, wow, that's just,
Yeah.
hijacking all sorts of different systems in the body. So anyway, I digress. But yes, it's the, I can't even remember what we were talking about now.
Trying to just distinguish between the step 3 detoxing and step 4 detoxing a little
Right.
bit. And so it's basically just continuing on with more binders and things of that nature in step 4 that you began the process of in step 3, it sounds like.
Yeah, and it's really, step 3 I think of as like more opening, and step 4 is more pulling.
Okay.
But we do have some of that already in step 3, and so oftentimes, because we're setting the stage, they just work in tandem. Oftentimes the binder plus the glutathione plus a number of these herbs for opening up the pathways. And so they'll spill into a step forward. It gives you a bit of a run up where people are like, oh, I'm really excited because these things I thought I had to address in step 4, I'm actually already addressing because I started in step 3. But, we're getting more specific also on, if you have mold or heavy metals or chemicals, to make sure that those are going to be targeted. And what's interesting is that there'll be the body will bind preferentially, and some of these binders will bind preferentially to certain toxins. So, you'll get like the first layer off, and then you'll do your testing maybe 6 months later. And then you see that you've got the second layer off. And then you're noticing that you're dumping a whole bunch of things that you didn't even see you had in the first testing, because you're getting into a deeper layer and you're noticing that you're dumping it. So that's always interesting, where people are like, why are my levels higher? And it's like, well, actually you're dumping something that you didn't even have before. Either you have all of a sudden you've got a whole bunch of exposure during the pandemic of gasoline, or you've gotten to a point where now you're dumping a whole bunch of it,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, totally. So we're kind of getting close to wrapping up, and I've got, I think, about 20 rabbit trails I'd like to go down. But, one of the things that I'd like you to share, if you had one or two success stories, somebody coming in and, what they had and maybe I should do this rabbit trail first, and then you can do both of these. As I'm studying, for some of the podcasts I'm doing, I'm learning more about oral health. Do you come into a situation and it could be, hey, we've done all of these things. Hey, you've got some things you're going to have to do orally. It could be a cavitation, could be metal, could be that kind of thing. And in that, maybe a couple of success stories as we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the dental stuff can definitely sometimes hijack the process, because it can be a bit exhaustive and financially challenging, but it's an important one. And it's also really challenging to find a biologic dentist who is going to be able to do that cone CT or is going to be able to do that thermogram. So we do our best to kind of direct people in certain places with IAOMT, or I can't remember the other organization, but if you're Googling like biologic dentist in my area, really important, because oftentimes, if you have cavitations or basically infections that are in the jaw, if you ever had your wisdom teeth pulled, you may have some sort of hidden thing, or if you've ever had a root canal, definitely want to get those things evaluated, because they can be contributing to some of the immune dysfunction that you have, because essentially you're getting a low level chronic infection that's causing this inflammation. It's hijacking the immune system, and you can't get rid of a number of these other components if you don't deal with that. So let's talk about Amber. She's if people are interested, we've been very fortunate. We have had people leave testimonials on our website, and so we have about almost 50 now of video and written testimonials. And Amber's one of them, who says that she was a Bartonella mess, where when she first came to us, she was an athlete, and she found that she was having pain in the bottom of her feet, and she was having muscle cramps, and her sleep was awful. She was having some anxiety, and there were a number of things at play, but that was kind of the big one. And so just I think, oh, and she also had hyperthyroidism initially with us. And oftentimes if somebody has hyper, they always have 99% of the time, they also have hypo. And so we fixed the hyper, which turns out that it was from H. pylori. So we addressed H. pylori, which is an infection in the gut that can cause hyper. So we addressed that, took care of that, didn't need pharmaceuticals for that. And then dealt with the hypo, which was caused by the Bartonella. And so what she found, and I think just 3 weeks working with, or 3 months working with us, just very quickly, she was able to move forward. She found that once she started going after the Bartonella, she had a significant improvement in her symptoms. And then you had to play the whack-a-mole a little bit with Bartonella and maybe some of these other infections. She had mold that we found in her home. But now she's working a full-time job. She's starting a business. Like, she's doing incredibly well. And, it's just a blessing to kind of help people on that path. Another person who'd be interesting to talk about, well, let's call her Diane. She had spontaneous sweating when she came to see us, and really, really awful depression that would just last for weeks. And she had attempted suicide several times. She would have panic attacks as well. And with her, the infection was Babesia. And so once we went through the 3 steps and we got into step 4, we started to ramp up on our the herbs that we use for Babesia. And just really after just a couple drops, even topically, this stuff is so powerful. She noticed a significant difference in her mood, in her energy, in her sleep. And so it's just, oftentimes it's about, we're getting rid of those symptoms, and then it's just about making sure that whatever allowed that infection to come out, that we set the stage, we remove all these other causes to make sure that we can get rid of that infection, and that those symptoms won't persist. Now, our goal is always to bring balance back into the body. Like I said early on, we're 90% bug cells, 10% human cells, and so it's not reasonable to think that we're going to get rid of these infections entirely. It's because people are like, oh yeah, we just have to get rid of them. No, it's about creating a new relationship with them, which is definitely a lot nicer, because they're just trying to survive in this environment, which has become increasingly hostile because the immune system is going after a whole bunch of things. And so we just need to quiet everything down and recalibrate and reset this relationship that we have with these infections.
Boy, I think that's a great way of summarizing it. There's an amazing reality to our existence, the microbiome and all of the different players that are involved here, the viruses, the bacteria, the human cells. So it's pretty amazing. How can we follow up with you? Where does one get in touch? You do telehealth. It sounds to me like basically you're not doing any pharmaceuticals that I'm aware of in any of these treatments. So for me, that's a great option for people to consider. How do we follow up?
Yeah, and I'm at fixyourfatigue.com, fixyourfatigue.com. We're all over social media. We've got a YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook group that has live Q&As every month. So if you have a question for me, that's the place to ask it. Just kind of get into that group, and you'll see the notifications. And on our website, we've got a Bartonella quiz that you can check out if you think maybe you've got Bartonella. And then we have is your fatigue fixable quiz as well, among ebooks and stuff like that to help people get educated. I also have a best-selling book that's been on Amazon if you like to read. So we're just here to help people. And if you do want to go deeper in this work and you haven't had the success that you want, definitely get on. We offer free calls where you can see if we can see if we can help you or not. And if we can share with you what we offer, which is group and one-on-one components of all those different things to make sure that you're going to be as successful as possible moving through our program.
That's awesome. Well, and I just thank you for being with us here today. It's a treasure of information. I hope people take advantage, that they look into it and see that there's some great options available to work with you. And so we'll call it a day there. I hope people will, lean into learning how to fix their fatigue and becoming better health advocates. So thank you again, Dr. Hirsch, for sharing with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate it.